Welcome to Second Saturday Conversation, an opportunity to explore and puzzle about Christianity in and for the 21st century. Christianity has arguably had a tremendous impact on history and culture and anthropology, and it shaped how we think about the world and us as humans and God and Jesus and reality itself. And in this 21st century, when we are taking a postmodern turn, we have an opportunity in our current and fast-changing historical and technological and ecological context to rethink and reimagine Christianity and the Jesus story, what it is becoming and what it can become. There will be more than one view and interpretation of Christianity and even Jesus, but whatever ours is, it has to acknowledge the diversity and complexity of our world and even our place in the cosmos. We at Second Saturday have varied backgrounds and experiences and interests, and we have varying degrees of commitment to the Jesus story, but obviously it still haunts us. And for many of us, it calls to us. So we are a lively and gracious group. Welcome to Second Saturday Conversation. Our overall theme for this year is Skylight and Seasoned Tongue and Groove. And that's an image taken from a poem of Seamus Heaney's. It's a wonderful poem, and we will post that poem as part of our closing slides. Skylight and Seasoned Tongue and Groove. A skylight, an opening in a closed ceiling. There are comforts in under and Seamus Heaney puts it, a tight lid fit old ceiling. But a skylight, Heaney goes on to say, holds surprise wide open. I'd like to think that Second Saturday is like a skylight, holding surprise wide open. Today we have two guests, and they are returning together, and they want to talk about Jesus. And we get to listen in and join in. Jack Caputo and Brandon Scott, our guests today, are actually two of my favorite people. And they may not know it, but, well, now everybody does. I mean, Jack is a radical theologian who has helped us and will help us reimagine and reconstruct our understanding of theology. And Brandon is an historian of Christianity with a keen ear for Jesus' parables. I mean, Jack loves baseball, the Phillies, God bless them. And Brandon is a photographer and a bird watcher. I mean, it just doesn't get any better than that. So I am delighted to have with us Brandon Scott and Jack Caputo as our guests today. My friend and colleague, Jeff Creswell, cannot be with us today. He usually orients us to the plenary time. But Jake, do you want to say a little something about how people, if they don't know, find the raised hand for when plenary time comes?
Sure. Let's see at the bottom of your screen. I'm not entirely sure if it's probably under the reactions. Yes. If you click on reactions, there's a raise hand button, and you can use that when we go to plenary time and during coffee time if you decide to stick around.
Yeah, perfect. And then Jake will help us and call on you when we get to that point. But now, without further ado, actually, let me bring in Jack and Brandon. Or Jake, you can bring in Jack and Brandon. I don't see Brandon yet. There we go. And if you can bring sort of Jack onto the main screen also. There we go. Okay, terrific. Let me ask you before you two, because I think that each of you are going to present sort of your perspectives on Jesus as we view him in this 21st century context. But before you each give your reflections, let me just ask you, why did you two want to come together to talk about this? I mean, Jack, why did you want to talk to Brandon? Brandon, why did you want to talk to Jack in particular? What is it about what each of you brings to this conversation that you both felt is important, not only for your own thinking, but for our hearing? So say a little bit about that, and then I'll turn the time over to you for your presentations. So why is it that you wanted to come together on this day with us?
Well, nobody else will talk to me. So,
so it's Jack Caputo's largesse, is that
yeah.
right?
I'm still considering.
So we're so grateful for that. Yeah.
From my
Well,
point
you know,
of
if they
view,
won't talk to you, I hope that they at least listen to you.
don't bet on it. From my point of view, you know, I was trained in a kind of scholarship that's the lonely tower. You know, you're up in your ivory tower, and if you work all day and get a footnote, you've really done well. And I've always envied the sciences that their work is collaborative. They don't work alone. They really work in groups. And I have found working in groups to be very, very cooperative. I have a small mind. And it's only by engaging other people that you can enlarge in your point of view, that you can see other things. Other people bring expertise. You think, oh, I didn't think about that, you know? And I find that exciting and engaging. And I particularly like talking to Jack because he gets addressed as a theologian, but he's really a philosopher. So he comes about these things not from what I think of as a theological prejudice. I find too many theologians, when they get in trouble, bring out the metaphysical wand and they wave it around and all the problems go away. And with Jack, you have somebody who's thinking philosophically. He's not defending a dogmatic tradition in some way, or doesn't feel like he has to, but he's rather, as a philosopher, asking the hard questions about how do we know these things? How do we know? You know, how does this play out? He's willing to take the radical step to push it farther. And I have long thought of New Testament scholars as the people who, from the point of view of theologians, know where all the bodies are buried. We know why the dogmatic tradition is bankrupt, why it doesn't work. There's a break right at the beginning, and it's a biggie. And Jack is willing to deal with that. That's as intriguing to him. It's not a threat. And that to me is the only way forward. So I look forward to this conversation. I always enjoy talking to Jack. He always tries to get me from being a historian, and I always try to get him to think about some facts. But it's a good conversation, and I, for one, value that, because I think we, as modern scholars outside the hard sciences, we think alone way too much. We need to be in groups, and we need to be in groups a lot more.
Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah, Brandon and I are sort of taking our show on the road here. We've done this several different times at Westar, and it's fruitful. You know, it's if you bring up the facts. You know, philosophers usually say, don't confuse us with the facts. We've got a complementary approach to Jesus, and I think it would apply to any scriptural text. And that is, I think we both think that if you start with the historical from the historical side, you're going to end up, and look at the New Testament, you're going to end up with literature. You're going to end up realizing that these are people telling stories. Stories didn't drop from the sky. These are people, and they pull their pants on one leg at a time, and they're telling stories. And the stories have depth, they have importance. If you start with the theological side, you discover that theology is either mystifying itself and thinks that it's got some kind of supernatural authorization, or it's literature. It's talking about literature. It's talking about imaginative figurations of what's going on in the name of God. And it can't hold or sustain or attain the status of theology, logos, science, scientific, conceptual, propositional knowledge. It can't get that far unless it mystifies itself and claims that it has divine authorization to say things that it doesn't know. And so what it really is, when you look at what it really thinks and believes, is a certain kind of imaginative vision of what's going on in the name of God. And so if you analyze theological discourse, you end up in theopoetics. If you start with historical exploration and investigation, you'll discover literature. Either one is going to bring you back to the same middle, which is what I've been calling, or other people call, I, along with others, call theopoetics. So we've got, the idea is there's been a war between history and theology, which I would say theology started. And we're trying to put that fire out. The two of them are not at war. They actually, the one reinforces the other. A good theological analysis will reinforce what, in fact, history shows if you can conduct your historical work without getting kicked out of the institution you work in.
Great. Thank you. That's a nice framing for hearing each of you say more about Jesus. And this being December, this being Advent, the beginning of a new liturgical year, this being Christmas, I thought, what better topic to talk about on this second Saturday than Jesus? So who would like to go first in terms of unfolding some of your thoughts?
I'm going to go first.
Okay, Brandon, great.
I want to give, I hope, a short example of why I think if you start with the parables, you end up with a literary analysis. Traditionally, parables have been treated as kind of simple tales for stupid people. And they had a kind of simple point. And I often wondered why, if Jesus had simple points, he just didn't say it. Why hide it in a parable? It's always struck me as kind of odd. But at any rate, the parable I want to use is the shortest of the parables. It's the leaven. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. That's it. Very, very short. And traditionally, this parable was understood to mean that from a little thing came a big thing. Traditionally, Augustine interprets this parable as that from a little thing, the preaching of Jesus, comes a big thing, the church. I always thought that kind of got Christology and ecclesiology backwards. But it kind of shows you what the church thinks of things, I think, in many ways, that it really is much more important than Jesus. But even with somebody like Jeremias, who's trying for a historical analysis of the parable, he didn't get much further. He says that what the parable means is from the teaching of Jesus comes this big thing, the kingdom. So he's really still staying on from the small to the big. In the late 60s, Bob Funk, really took seriously this idea that parables are a metaphor. And I don't want to go into detail, but he asked what the metaphor is and how it works. And he began to say, okay, these aren't simple teachings. He's really coming out of the new literary criticism. If these as parables are inviting you into an imaginative experience, and that's fundamental. He's shifting from understanding parables as being teaching you a point to inviting you into an experience. So in that sense, for Funk, the parables become a kind of an experience, an imaginative experience of the kingdom. Or I would prefer to say the empire, but I don't really care. So you take this parable and you say the kingdom of God. Say, what's the kingdom of God? Well, if you tell a parable about the kingdom, it means you don't actually know. There's a certain mystery there. So that's why you use a metaphor. That's the whole point of a metaphor, is you're talking about a thing that's not quite explainable in and of itself. We don't really quite know what this is. But if it's about God, it's got to be about good. It's got to be about Israel. Don't forget that. It's the God of Israel. It's just not any old God. And if it's a basileia, it has to be about empire. It has to be about power. It has to be about ruling. So, and it has to be about Rome. You can't talk about empires in the ancient world without talking about Rome. It's the big 2,000-pound gorilla that sits down on whatever it wants to. And you can't say, well, this is religion and politics. No, they fit together like a glove in the ancient world. So that's always in the background somewhere. So then it's like leaven. Well, in a Jewish audience, leaven would automatically be a what-ho word. That doesn't go with God. Leaven is unclean. Leaven is what you cleanse out of your house for Passover in order to celebrate. It makes the house unclean. So it's a conspicuous sign in the ancient world. You know, Paul uses the little saying, don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? He's saying that makes the whole thing unclean. So we're not in the right category. We got a category problem right off. You're being invited to come in and think of God as somehow unclean. Mm-hmm. That undoes stuff that you're now in a whole different world. Something has gone wrong here. And then the next one is it's a woman. Well, that's as bad as leaven. You know, we're not, you know, if it's going to be the kingdom of God, we need to talk about David, something like, we got to talk about some powerful figure here, not a woman, you know. The state of Oklahoma has just decided to alert me that we have a disaster going on. It's called our local government. That's what that sound was. Actually, it's called Amber Alerts. But at any rate, so these images just are not working. They're actually crashing together, so that the hearer is asking, what is going on here? What is being asked of me? Okay, it's like leaven, which a woman took and hid. The Greek word here is apocalypso. It's a bad word for hiding. It's to hide something that's been concealed. This is not the apocalypso, the apocalyptic word, which apocalyptic. This is, she steals it. So it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And then she hires it in 3 measures of flour. Now, 3 measures is a lot of flour. It's about 40 pounds. This is no ordinary baking session. So it's now becoming almost a burlesque. Except 3 measures occurs a couple of times in the Hebrew tradition when Epiphany is going to happen. Mm-hmm. When Abraham meets the 3 angels at the Oaks of Mamre, one of whom is Yahweh. That's a great story. It's one of the oldest form critical stories in the Hebrew Bible. Yahweh comes to visit. It's after the harvest and the shearing. He's like a landlord coming to collect the rents. That's before he bought the condo in the sky. He still lived down the block. So He comes to collect the rents. And Abraham tells Sarah to prepare 3 measures of cakes for the 3 angels that are there. This is an epiphany. And she laughs. And that becomes Isaac's name. She laughed. It's really a convoluted story. So this story is making a reference to that kind of, this is somehow like what happened at the Oaks of Mamre. This is a manifestation of God. But look what it looks like. It looks like a woman with leaven and all of this stuff, until it's unleavened, until it leavens everything. That is, until it corrupts everything. So here's an image of the kingdom of God, not as blessed happiness and bringing all this cheer, but as corrupting everything around. So that's a whole new way of thinking about God. Well, immediately people will say, "Wait, that can't work. That's a no-go here. God's good." You might not find it that way. It's asking you to reimagine things. I think, Jesus is an oral storyteller. That's the category he belongs to. He's an oral storyteller long before he's the Son of God. And I agree with Jack. You need a poetics to think about Jesus, not a Christology. It's the wrong category. Really interesting thing here. I think if you'd have argued with Jesus, you'd have said, you can't really think God's like leaven. He'd say, well, let me tell you another one, and you get another story. So he'd tell you something like the treasure. Oh, treasure, that's right. That's good. See, the treasure is really good. Okay, that's a lot more like God, except the treasure turns out to corrupt the guy. He sells everything he has to buy this land, but he can't dig it up. If he dug that treasure up, the villagers are going to say, "Where'd you get all that money?" "Oh, that land I just bought last week." "Oh, wait a minute. If you knew there was treasure on that land, it belonged to the person who owned the land. They'd have to give it up." So this poor guy's got to sit on it for how long? And he hasn't got any money. He's going to starve to death. I mean, it's a hilarious story. So every time you get in one of these parables, they start to unravel the world you think is fixed. And in unraveling that, he's not telling you the way the world is. He's asking you to imagine the way the world could be. What could you see that would be different? That to me is kind of the essence of the parable. Dodd was really right. It teases the mind into active thought. It teases you. I don't like thought in Dodd's definition, but I do like it teases the mind. It brings you into an experience that allows you to re-envision the world, to reimagine what the world might be like and how you might be in that world. That to me is the basis off which one might then build a new world, think about a new world. So it's yours, Jack.
To start with unmuting myself. One of the great figures in the history of the historical Jesus scholarship is David Strauss, who wrote the famous Das Leben Jesu, like Jesus, in 1835. Well, it turns out that in 1831, Strauss went to Berlin to study with Hegel. Schleiermacher too, but Hegel. And unfortunately, Hegel upped and died on him that year, and it, I'm sure, frustrated his plans. But why was he interested in Hegel? Hegel, very famous, very difficult philosopher. It's because Strauss thought that Hegel had the answer. Hegel was the guy who could explain what the theologians and the historians were arguing about and resolve the problem. And Hegel, things come in threes for Hegel, right? Hegel said, Hegel had what he called this philosophy of the absolute spirit. The absolute spirit is our consciousness of God. And he said it occurs in three gradually higher forms: art, religion, and I must say, with all due humility, philosophy at the top. And he said, philosophy, or he said, religion is more conceptual than art and more sensuous than philosophy. So religion is sort of Goldilocks in a certain way. Art is the experience of God as the beautiful, and it's immersed in sensuousness. Philosophy is the experience of God as pure truth, and it's super sensuous, and it's conceptual knowledge. We in philosophy we form a concept of God. Religion's in the middle. Says religion, he says, he's a philosopher, right? So he says religion is actually philosophy for people who can't understand philosophy and who get their philosophy in a sensuous form. So he says religion doesn't have concepts, right? It does have concepts, but it doesn't have the big philosophical concepts, hard concepts, real concepts that actually can grasp. Religion works through what he calls a Vorstellung, by which he meant an imaginative figuration, a work of a collaboration between the conscious and the unconscious, between the mind and the body and the visceral foundations of experience, and it brings forth an image which expresses something about God, but makes no pretense to a concept. And he says, and we can experience this. We can undergo this. It provides us with an intuition, an insight into what's going on in the name of God, and it comes to us in the form of icons, iconic figures, iconic imaginative variations. It lets the spirit become visible. Now, Strauss was interested in this. He was struck by this. He was interested in this distinction between an imaginative figuration and a concept. And he thought it would resolve the following problem, which was the war that had been going on since the 18th century through the 19th century between the naturalists and the supernaturalists. The naturalists said, wait, Jesus didn't actually walk on water. Can't do that. Laws of physics don't permit it. What happened was he was walking on very large boulders at water level. And from a distance, it looked like he was walking on water. Right? Lazarus wasn't actually dead. He was in a deep sleep. And he woke him up. So for each of these miracles in the New Testament, we can explain that. We can make sense out of it. The opposite reaction was supernaturalism, which is Jesus is God. This is, and these scriptures are divine revelations of things that no one would ever have been able to know. And they're recorded for us in Revelation. The question was, for Strauss, and I think for Brendan and for me and for a lot of people, how do you make sense of Jesus without naturalizing him just reducing him to a good guy, or without supernaturalizing. Now, how do you take them seriously on either of those accounts? The supernaturalist account, this is the Enlightenment, this is the 19th century, this is the age of reason. Enlightenment says supernatural account is basically, it's crazy. It's some kind of voodoo. But the naturalist account, Hegel said, yeah, but the naturalist account just makes him into a guy who spoke truth to power and got himself killed. Now, if that's all Jesus is, we don't need him. We've already got Socrates. We've already got any number of great people who put their lives on the line and got killed for it. So Hegel said, Jesus, what's important about Jesus is not exactly who this historical figure was, but this narrative, this story, which is the New Testament, which is providing us with an insight into the meaning of God, what's going on in the name of God. Jesus is this imaginative figuration. And that's the really important part about him. The important part is the story, the figure, the Vorstellung, the living history that he brought forth. So Hegel is in effect making a distinction. He said, well, isn't that turning him into God again? No. It's treating him as a figure of God. So for Hegel, the real distinction is not between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. The real distinction is between the Jesus of prosaic, of historical investigation, which is conducted in prose, in the soberness of prose, of the concept, the Jesus of prose, and the Jesus of poetics. The distinction is not between natural and supernatural, faith and reason. It's between prose and poetry, between the prose of the factual history and the theopoetic space which Jesus enters in the New Testament. According to Dom Crossan, in the Jesus of history, the body of the Jesus of history was left to rot at the foot of the cross and be eaten by dogs. In theopoetic space, they killed him, but he wouldn't stay dead. He healed the lame. He raised the daughter of Jairus. He fed the hungry. He walked on water. In theopoetic space, not the space of supernatural revelation. Right? So there's another notion of revelation. There's a genuine revelation going on here, but it's not a supernatural one. It's an insight into a paradoxical form of life of the sort that Brandon just described, where God stands in solidarity with the oppressed, where it's Alice in Wonderland, right? It's upside down. It's the first are last and the last are first. The outsiders are in, the insiders are out. The poor are privileged, the richer have to pass through an eye of a needle. Trespassers are met with forgiveness. Enemies are met with love. It's a crazy world. It's an upside down world. It's an insight that you won't find in any philosopher. You won't find Aristotle talking like that, or Plato, or Kant, or Spinoza. This is a vision of life, an insight into a way to be, which is embodied in those stories. It's not supernatural, and it's not just he was actually walking on large rocks. But saying he was walking on large rocks is like somebody fact-checking a novel and saying, well, obviously the novelist made this up. You see, Don't you know how to read? Do you know what a story is? If you want to read this book, you have to know how to read a story. So if you analyze what theology is doing, theology is trying to offer some kind of account in its sort of what I would call second order discourse about stories. So theology is in fact theopoetics, and it proceeds by what I like to call, and now I'm using some philosophical jargon, the suspension of the supernatural attitude. Just drop it. You don't disprove it. You just say, it just doesn't, I don't believe it. It doesn't make sense. And it's mystifying. It's a mystification. The suspension of the supernatural attitude, along with the suspension of the naturalistic attitude, which is like fact checking a novel for its factual truth. Suspend them both. And where are you? In theopoetic space. So, one last word. When I say poetic, I'm not saying poetry. I'm saying it's a discursive form, which could take any form. It could become a hymn, it could become a song, it could become a prayer, and it could become a meditation, which is not ornamenting something that we already know or that we've already got, either from faith or reason. It's not a reproductive imagination, but a productive one. It's producing something. It's generating images of what? We don't know. What? Karl Rahner uses the expression, the mystery we call God. It's the mystery that predominates. It's the mystery of life and death, of birth and illness, of suffering, of good and evil, of the powers and the principalities and versus the powers of God. It's the limit conditions of our existence, which we are groping towards poetically, not in the sense of writing verse or of ornamenting. It's not a hymn that ornaments something, but in the sense of a creative imagination trying to bring forth images which resonate with the depth of our being. So they are not arbitrary, they're not capricious. This is not Feuerbach saying these are all subjective projections. This is us speaking from the depth of our being about the mystery of our being figuratively, which is the only way you can do it. So Hegel's notion that there's a philosophical level up above that's going to clarify all this with its concepts is an illusion. And that was the illusion that was broken by a man named Schelling, but was made famous by a man named Kierkegaard. So what you've really got are figures, imaginative figures, with no teeth, no legendum that's going to decode the whole thing and tell us what those figures are figures of. They are figures of the mystery of being. And theology misunderstands itself by thinking that it has a logos there. It doesn't have a logos. When it does have a logos, what it produces is deism or Aristotle or some kind of impersonal force, but it never, it's missing it. The concept misses it. What gets it, what doesn't get it, but what addresses it is the poetic, imaginative, productive figuration of something we know not what. So I think that the historical investigation is not just compatible with this account, it's absolutely necessary. Because without it, you can't demystify the supernatural. So the historical account suspends the supernatural by demystifying it and explains to us what gods they were dealing with here. But you can't leave it there, because otherwise you'll expose yourself to naturalism. What you've got to do is recognize that you're dealing with literature, which any sensitive historical report will do, and any demystifying theological reflection will do. So the history and the theology will both come back to this same point of theo literature, theo poetics, imaginative figurations, not not conceptual laws or principles. So that's my shtick.
Let me make a comment. What I'm hearing you say, Jack, is that sort of that supernatural framework, it may have appealed to an imaginary in the ancient world, but not anymore. And so and if religion tries too much to be specific about a concept concerning God, we claim to know more than we can, because God is basically a mystery. Okay. That said, what is it, and that what if that Jesus, his own experience and sensibilities suggested that there's another way to live, that what it means to be human has more to do with compassion and healing and dealing with those who have been subject to injustice, and it's much different than a power play from on high, or some kind of a hierarchical oppressive thing. That Jesus is saying, no, there's another way of being human and being in the world. And this was part of his vision. And his intuition was that had a lot to do with, quote unquote, God. So what, in a sense, parsing out philosophical and theological categories is important, but why is Jesus important? What did he suggest about reality or God or what it means to be human? Why is he so important and so important for us? And if we think he's important, then is it not our responsibility to do what we can to make that Jesus story more either accessible or intelligible than the way it's often presented?
Sure.
So I'd love to hear from both of you on that. I mean, why?
Yeah, I mean,
why
he
is he
said
important?
something. See, I mean, he said something that you're not going to find in any philosopher that I know of, except the ones that have been influenced by this tradition. If you look at someone like Aristotle was talking about well-educated, good-looking, wealthy men. When he talked about what he called the phronimos, the prudent man, he meant prudent men.
Prudent Greek men.
And he meant people who were, I mean, he had a beautiful vision of wisdom, right? And it's in many ways a lovely thing. But if someone gave him a copy of the New Testament, he would have just scratched his head and said, "What are these people talking about? The lowly, the ill." He would have looked at 1 Corinthians 1 and said, "What? God prefers the weak and the ill-born? The divine means the eternal, everlasting, true, good, and beautiful. And you're saying it has to do with the ill-born, the low-born, the weak, and the lowly, the nothings and nobodies.
Mm-hmm.
It's craziness." So you've got a radically different vision of existence,
Mm-hmm.
of compassion and a kind of a mad love, and what I like to call sometimes a sacred anarchy
Mm-hmm.
in the kingdom of God. And that's how the word God is operating. Brendan once gave when we started up the God seminar, we asked Brandon to come in and say, to build a bridge between the Jesus seminar and the God seminar. And so he gave this paper on the kingdom of, and we said to him, we want you to give a paper on what Jesus thought about God. What was Jesus' theology of God? And Brandon said, well, he didn't really talk about God. He talks about the kingdom of God. And he doesn't really, and then you say, well, what's the kingdom of God? He says, well, he doesn't really talk about the kingdom of God. He talks about leaven and treasures hidden in the field. So every time he asks about God, he tells you a story. And so I raised my hand and I said, Brandon, does the kingdom of God need God? That is the classical, supreme, omnipotent, omniscient being of that Greek philosophical movement known as Christian Neoplatonism. And the answer is no, right? Because this being translates without remainder into these stories, this form of life, which from a philosophical point of view is quite paradoxical and striking. So yeah, our job is to try to keep that going. And but when you said that this classical mythological view is not still around, isn't believable anymore, unfortunately, it's it's rampant. It's all over the place.
Mm.
And there are plenty of institutions where if you said anything like we're saying, you lose your job. So supernaturalism, Christian nationalism is fired by this kind of supernaturalist stuff. That's why these Christian nationalists have made a pact with the devil. They recognize that Trump is a scoundrel, but they think he's the scoundrel they need right now to save the supernatural truth of Christianity in this white Christian nation. So supernaturalism is poison, and it's alive and well in Oklahoma, and it's alive and well 25 miles from where I live. I mean, you get on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, drive for 25 miles, and you got posters, billboards condemning evolution.
It may have a rhetorical punch, but that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it true. So what are we to do?
Well,
so Brandon, why is Jesus important, and why is he important for us?
I want to back off slightly. I agree essentially with what Jack's saying. I think it's important to understand that the supernatural in the ancient world is not supernatural in the same sense it gets used in the modern world. They have a 3-storied universe, so they have the supernatural built into it.
Right.
Okay. If you use supernatural in the modern world after the Enlightenment, it's a whole different kind of thing. It's not part of the natural world because we've redefined what we mean by the natural world. So you then have to live in 2 worlds if you're going to believe in the supernatural, a natural world and this supernatural world. And a lot of people do that. I agree with Jack. It's perfectly rampant, and now it's dangerous. It has become dangerous. And that needs to be said right out. I don't find anything about Jesus that demands the supernatural at all. That comes from Neoplatonism. And he's quite reluctant to talk about God. He keeps God pretty pushed off. And in fact, Judaism as a whole is pretty, I mean, at that point, he's being a good Jew. You stay kind of silent on this issue. Christians are and by that I mean people in 3rd and 4th century are become the ones who think they can really talk about God. You read early texts from the first 2 or 3 centuries, there's very little talk about God and not a lot of talk about Jesus. It's mostly about community and how we get along. And it's, that needs to be taken seriously. Second thing is, this distinction that you're moving out of Hegel is a great distinction. I think it's the right one. Because I'm a huge fan, have been most of my life, of Emily Dickinson. And the Emily Dickinson of the poem is not the Emily Dickinson whose house you can visit. You know, they're two different people. You know, that the poet is a creation of the imagination of the poet. So there's a kind of projection here. They have to start. Jesus, who tells these stories and creates these stories, is himself a creation of him.
Mhm.
So there's so that creation goes on is perfectly feasible. That's how literature works. That's what gives it its imaginative hold. I want to say one other thing here too. For odd reasons, I just never got along with Plato. And I have a big folder in my desk that says the problem is Plato. And every time I find one, I stick it in there. And it's a big, thick folder. And Neoplatonism, I think, was the seduction of Christianity. I think most Christians are much more Neoplatonists than they are followers of Jesus.
Yeah.
Saving your soul is a Neoplatonist idea. It's not a Jesus idea. But at any rate, I think one of the things that the parable, like the leaven, you take any of these parables, I think they basically end up in the same thing. They're saying the world as it is not divinely ordered.
Mhm.
You know, that's the whole point of the leaven. You know, if you have clean things and unclean things, you know how the world is ordered, how God has said it should be. Well, he comes along and says, that's not true. That's not working. So you're now, the very parable itself, if you take it seriously, imaginatively, is destroying this effort to say, the world is ordered this way. This is the way it is. This is the way God created it. No. This is a radical analysis of what it means to be a human,
Right.
to be at home in this world as it is, not
Right.
as you imagine it should be, to figure out how to make it work. So I think that remains the continuing human task. We've not solved that problem. We're not even close.
Right.
Uh,
And do you think that Jesus, in his language and the power of his language, and that he in a sense, he invites us to imagine a very different way of being?
yes. Do I think he's unique in that way? No. Other people have done that. I don't have any problem with that at all. But I'm a Westerner and I was raised in this tradition, and it is a way I think. I think I should be open enough to think in other ways too. So not as to be so exclusive. We don't have the luxury anymore of being exclusionary. That's we're in too dangerous a situation to do that. But yeah, and I find in Jesus, and I think the tradition found in Jesus, a persuasive way of trying to imagine these things. And that's why it keeps erupting throughout the history. It's not a church. If you look at history, Christianity was never a thing. It's always reinventing itself.
Right.
And always rediscovering itself. That's an illusion that, the deposit of fake sacred traditions.
I mean, one of the things that follows from speaking about theopoetics is the multiplicity of approaches, because you're talking about something that's embedded in language and culture, right? So the powers of imagination are forged in a cultural, historical, linguistic, and geographical setting. So there will be as many versions of theopoetics as there are cultural traditions. And those cultural traditions have sort of what you might call focal objects, iconic figures, which organize the lines of force in that culture. And up to now, the biblical tradition generally and Christianity, the figure of Jesus has been powerful. It's losing its power now.
Mhm.
It's in trouble now. It's starting to relegate itself into the quarters of the undereducated, and it's beginning now to become reactionary. So it's beginning to lose it. It's starting to become unbelievable, I think, and I don't know that there's any rescuing it or not. But in any case, there would be a multiplicity of such traditions. I remember one time going to a trip to Hawaii, and we took a tour of an ancient Hawaiian village, and this person conducting the tour was really quite good and explained to us the sacredness of lava rock. If you live on the tip of a volcano in the middle of the Pacific, there's like two things, lava rock and water. And the lava rock was there, figured very much like what Tilly calls the ground of being, this deep resource, and they had a reverence for it that was uh, very powerful. And nothing to do with God and another world and the Trinity, nothing. But it was a very powerful, imaginative figuration of life, the danger of going out into that ocean every morning to fish and asking for the aid and protection of the rock, and then coming back home safely and thanking the lava rock for protecting it. It's a form of life. So religion is a form of life, and it's a form of life that is organized around certain iconic figures. And so they're asking what is the one true religion is incoherent. It would be like asking what is the one true language. This doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent.
It asking the one true religion is also a holdover from imperialism. And that's something Christianity really needs to come to terms with. It's got
Right.
this imperial heritage, and it's dangerous.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's no one true religion. Living in the West, in the last 15 years or so, have become very interested and somewhat enamored of native religions because their approach to Earth has a huge amount of wisdom, it seems to me, compared to the rapacious view in the West. And there's a huge amount of wisdom in that. Mother Earth makes a lot more sense to me than Father God, frankly.
Mhm.
And I find that kind of image and metaphor
Mhm.
much more engaging
Yeah.
than I do the kind of classical Western view of God.
Yeah. I'm
And
reminded of,
it gets into the Western tradition in the various forms of mysticism and nature
Yes.
mysticism and panentheism, which and Tillich himself in the notion of the ground of being is a retrieval of the truth of what they called the nature religions. They and we up until the 20th century made a distinction between mythology, which meant the nature religions, and revelation, which meant us. Right? And now we discover those nature religions, the so-called mythologies, were profoundly revelatory.
Yeah.
And as the historians are showing us, what we've been calling revelation is laced with mythology, right? So the distinction, each of the mythological has, we recognize the depth of the mythological and the mystification in what we call revelation or special revelation. And once you do both those things, they're just different. They're not rank ordered anymore.
Mm. Mm. this is a little bit of a sidebar, but when you were talking about lava and then nature, I've been reading Gerard Manley Hopkins lately, and he talked about how psyllium shines. Okay, that's like coal, how psyllium shines and gashes gold vermilion. It's like, what is the deep down freshness in things? What is the thisness in our natural world? And I think there's a tremendous amount of wonder and beauty and fierceness in our natural world. And and this is where we live. We live in this world. And so how, I'm going to open it up to plenary in just a second, but how, I mean, I'm repeating myself, but if we think that what Jesus is saying is that his vision of who we are is possible, and not only possible, but important. And if we think that that sense of importance is relative today,
We don't know when
what is our responsibility to be good stewards and to, in a sense, reinvent or reinterpret the Christian story or the Jesus story to keep that true to itself, and not let, for instance, the Christian right, claim Jesus as their sovereign king? How is it also our responsibility to continue to tell the story in a way that will help us live our life and assure a future? And I maybe I'm asking the wrong questions, but
Maybe the wrong people. I've started in the last year or so to think about these questions a little bit differently.
yeah, good.
I was kind of raised in the tradition of the first quest, and then the new quest, and then I actually coined the term the third quest. And I think that language is wrong. I made a mistake. The first quest began in the late 2nd century and ended with the Enlightenment, although it's still going full bore. And that's the dogmatic quest.
Okay.
What happens with the Enlightenment is the second quest, which is for the historical Jesus. And the historical Jesus dissolves that dogmatic quest. That's one of the fundamental things it does. It proves it's without basis. And so therefore, there really needs to be a radical new quest based upon the full humanity of Jesus, taking him seriously as a poet, as a peasant, and by taking that seriously, it forces us to take our own humanity seriously. How do we make sense? And the Enlightenment on has really radically, I keep using the word radical, but I think it's true. That's why we're in so much trouble. Has radically redefined what it means to be human, because we now live in a universe that's so huge and so wondrous, we become totally insignificant. I mean, what passes for the Christian imagination today strikes me as so impoverished compared to what the James Webb telescope's showing us. I just find it kind of ridiculous. So to be religious today, I want to be religious. I don't know whether I haven't been Christian for a long time. I sometimes say, people get mad at me, but if Jesus wasn't a Christian and Paul wasn't a Christian, why should I be one? At least it's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
And so I have no problem thinking of myself as a follower of Jesus and Paul, but I'm not a Christian, not in any of those imperialist terms. For me, the issue is, how do we reimagine ourselves religiously? And I think religion is important. It's the way we, Jack talked about this when he first talked. It's the way in which we come to terms It's not institutional religion. It's the way we come to terms with this new world we are dealing with. And we're just at the beginning, I think, of trying to figure that out.
Mm.
I don't even think we're close. And unfortunately, we may not have a lot of time to do it.
Right.
But the death knell of the old pre-enlightenment world is going to be hell to pay. It's tough.
Yeah. Okay.
That's not an answer. I don't have an answer to your question, is what I'm saying. But I think
Yeah,
I'm
I mean,
beginning to see where we have to go.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is,
when
I
you
think,
introduce
about
the
our
cosmic
humanity and our humaneness. Jack, and then we'll open it up.
when you introduce the cosmic perspective like that, I think everything changes. I think classical theism just simply becomes unbelievable when you do that, and some version of panentheism makes a great deal more sense, because that in which we live and move and have our being is this incomprehensibly vast,
Or maybe
hundreds of
even Mother
millions.
Earth.
Right.
Yeah, Mother Earth, which is but a pale blue dot,
Yes.
a speck of dust in a cosmos of hundreds of billions of galaxies,
Right.
not stars, galaxies. And then you really do have to localize Jesus. I mean, Jesus belonged to an utterly different world.
Right.
And the further complication is the evolution of human intelligence, which is heading straight for some kind of post-human condition, in which we will no longer be born of Adam and Eve and saved by Jesus. They really are aiming at some kind of post-human situation. And so what would Jesus have to do with that? And that's upon us.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that our humanity and our humaneness we need to grapple with that, and that will determine our future. How we understand our humanity. And I think that Jesus' vision gives us a sense of what it can look like. Maybe that's too simplistic, but
I think from my perspective, I'm pretty much where Jack is. My interest in Jesus is, I've spent my life on it, still interested. But, I think reclaiming our history we have to do that in order to understand how we got in this situation. But we also have to get beyond it. We have got to move forward. So to me, understanding Jesus and understanding the history of Christianity is a deconstructive task. That deconstruction is important. And I don't mean destructive, I mean deconstructing.
right.
That is important. There's also a positive in there that you can pull out of that. And yes, but we need more than that. We need to really move in a very different way.
Okay. I know that a number of people have their hands up. I think we should move to them. They'll bring a different perspective and angle. So Jake, you can help us with that. By the way, I don't read the chat, but I did notice one little line that said, I think that Robin Myers had a good question in the chat. And I didn't see it, but I bet he did. And perhaps, Robin, are you willing to share your question from the chat? And then we'll go ahead and take call upon some of the people who have their hands raised.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, there you are.
Hi, Jack. Hi, Brandon.
Hi, Robin.
The question is, if the story of the Israel versus Hamas war is told 100 years from now, what would the theopoetics of that narrative sound like? What would we have learned or not learned about terrorism, and what a truly religious response to it might be?
Well, there we
Well, I
go.
mean, the first thing you learn is that there's no theopoetics there at all. I mean, there's theocracies. You got a war between two theocracies, one calling itself a democracy but is sold out to the far right theocratic right in Israel. So you got Netanyahu, who has just basically tried to stay in power by catering to an extreme right, and those policies in conflict with a theocratic terrorist movement. And you get a war between two theocracies. There's no theopoetics. If there was poetics there, they would just understand themselves to be cousins in a grand Abrahamic tradition, and just different, not enemies. So it's the lack of theopoetics that is we're be witnessing here.
Okay.
I think the first question is, will somebody be around in 100 years to write that history?
Right.
I don't think that's a given. It probably is, but it would be close. I think too, it will be viewed as one of a series, but it may be a very climactic one, because this might be the last war of European colonialism. Israel might be the last European colonial state. That hasn't gone well for any other European colony, so that doesn't bode well. But I think what we're seeing here is potentially a genocide against the Palestinians. I think that's not out of the cards.
And since this is being recorded, you realize that what you have just said places you in some real danger.
Yes. I'm saying maybe. I'm not, I hope Biden will be wise enough. I think he's made a lot of steps to try to prevent it. I hope he's wise enough to continue to do that. It's a very delicate line.
Yeah.
I don't see it. It's a tough line.
Okay. Thanks to both of you very much. Great to see you.
You too. How do both of you have so much hair and I don't have any?
It's DNA. DNA is destiny. I'll let somebody else get on here.
Okay, thank you, Robin. I'm glad you were with us today. Okay.
Let's see. We'll go to Jim High.
Okay, thank you, Jake. And we're running a little bit, we have about 15 minutes left, a little less than that. So keep that in mind. Hello, Jim High.
Good morning to everyone. I was just thinking, as this wonderful program this morning, that we've got to get the Christian church, which we all were members of in one way or another. We've got to get them away from what they've been doing for hundreds of years and get them into doing something that applies to today. Could we not have a new Methodist church and a new Baptist church, a new Presbyterian, a new Episcopalian, a new Christian church that deals with today's problems and forgets about what happens after we die, because nothing happens after we die, and could forget that Jesus is the son of some God up in the sky? Could we not just point out the things about Christianity that progress has told us are not true, and get on with what is true? And that is how to live this life now.
Right.
But it's a hard problem.
Yeah.
It'd be like taking the NFL and saying scoring points doesn't matter. It's how you play the game. And we got a group of people over here that are going to judge how you play the game and give you points for that.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard
That's
problem.
bringing it down to street level, Jim. Thank you.
Yes, well, that's what I try to do always. Good to see everybody.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much.
Let's see. We'll go to Cheryl McGinnis.
Can you?
You're in and out.
Better now.
Keep going. Well, I'll let you know. You're muted. Cheryl, you're muted.
Okay. All right.
I'm afraid, yeah. And now we hear nothing at all. Okay. Work on that, and if you find it back, we'll get back to you. Okay?
Let's see. The next person just has their name set as iPad.
Okay. Here we
So
are.
so iPad.
That, hello, do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Actually, I never knew that was my name, but that's, that sounds good. I've been struggling the last year to try to understand more of what you're all talking about. Jack Caputo and I have the exact same, not exact, but for the first 21 years of our lives, we have the same background. I went to Calvert Hall that Jack mentions in one of his books, and I in Baltimore, and then I went to LaSalle. The training I got there in religion is quite different from what what I'm hearing, and I was wondering if Jack could just give me an idea. What was the turning point that moved you into this direction? Oh, my name is Len, Len.
Yeah, great.
Well, I think the culprit was philosophy. When I began to seriously engage philosophy, I began to realize that I was I had been taking things literally that should be understood differently, and I went through a period where I just got rid of it all. You know, I just dropped it all. I just thought it was crazy. But it really was philosophy. I mean, I began to read um, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. It was back in the day, right? And they just got me out of it. I mean, I began to one of the things that I remember seeing early on and thinking early on was um, the historicity of the categories in which we think, and I began to see that what I thought was divine revelation was an historical configuration, an historical, and as Brandon was saying, very Neoplatonic formulation of something that, uh, for example, as a good Catholic, we believe in transubstantiation, and then you find out substance is Aristotle's word. It's a completely Aristotelian a piece of Aristotelian metaphysics. And whatever that thing means, whatever's going on there in that sacrament, that would just be one way of talking. So I began to appreciate the historicity of things. And as Brandon said at one point, the best way to deconstruct something is to write a meticulous history of it. And you see, it didn't drop from the sky. And that I learned in an interesting way from Heidegger, because Heidegger was always talking about the history of being. So it was philosophy that sort of broke the grip of things. And then what brought me back to thinking about religion again was actually Derrida and this very Jewish messianic idea of hope and expectation and the empty chair for Elijah and the to come and Advent, the coming. And structure of expectation that he was working on completely secular terms. And then I saw a way to go back and sort of reinvent this thing that I learned at LaSalle. And I not only went to LaSalle, I was in the LaSallian Brothers. And I didn't want to blow that up. I wanted to reinvent it. Because I still thought, there's this figure of Jesus that Mary Ann's been talking about, that never left me.
Mhm, mhm.
And so I wanted to rescore it, reinvent it, reimagine it. But it was philosophy did it. A lot of my friends went to LaSalle, got jobs, got married, got a dog, 3 kids, and they're as Catholic as they were when they were going to Catholic grade school. Still that way. They didn't study Heidegger.
And I bet you're not hanging out with them.
I'm not what?
You're not hanging out with those guys.
Oh yeah, I see those guys.
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
I think
thanks
I'm,
very much. I appreciate
I
it.
think I'm the intellectual. I'm the geek.
Thank you, Len, for your question very much. Okay, and if we have a couple of quick ones, and then we will go into a coffee time, which we call it, from 11:05 to about 11:25. And for those of you who can stay and have not had a chance to have your questions asked, maybe we can do it then. But Jael, maybe maybe we can get in 2 more, and then I'm going to do a brief close. Unmute yourself, Jael.
Yes, I got it late to the conversation. I got sidetracked this morning.
Well, I have gotten late to this conversation myself, but in another manner of speaking.
What impressed me and what I got from John and Brandon, and particularly was driven home when Brandon said, if Paul and Jesus were not Christian, then I don't have to be either. And based on what's been saying, it seems to me, instead of calling us Christians, we should go back to the old ancient thing, people of the way, because there were 2 ways. One led to life and one led to death. And I think that is a better description of what it means, the choices we have in being human. We can choose to live in a way that promotes life, or we can choose a way that we crumble and die inside and become nothing, and we are no longer the salt of the earth. So I think returning to the ancient, it's either life or death. We have a choice. And I think that's what Jesus was all about. We have a choice.
Nice.
That's it.
Thank you, Jill.
When I was working on the book After Jesus Before Christianity, in the process of doing that book, I read everything we have extant from Christian groups from, the beginning all the way up to 250. And I read all that material trying to figure out what are they calling themselves. For most of the part, nothing. A lot of them have no name. The way is one, but it's not common at all. It's pretty minor.
Yeah, I got that from the Didache.
Yeah, I picked that up quick. It's also in Barnabas too, almost exactly the same way. But at any rate, they have all kinds of words. The slaves is actually fairly common, especially in the early period. You see it in the Acts of Paul and Thecla. She refers to themselves as the slaves of the anointed. Christian is a terrible word. I think until you get to the 3rd century, there aren't anything as Christians in the way we use that term. Before then, when the word is used, and it's fairly rarely, it means those who adhere to the anointed or those who belong to the anointed. And it means they're Jewish. I think it really does. Until you get into the 3rd century, that term always means, when Pliny uses it, he thinks these people are Christianoi. He thinks they're a Jewish messianic sect. That's what he means by the term. And it may actually be a Roman bureaucratic term. That may be where it originated. But there's no consistent term for any of these things. And the vocabulary is very varied. And I think we should they don't care who they are. I don't think that's the primary issue. So maybe we need to rethink that whole thing. And I think it's odd that, maybe it's not odd, how many Catholics have ended up in this historical Jesus research. there's a lot of us, and that's kind of odd because most Catholics aren't very interested in the historical Jesus. They're much more interested in the Christ, but I guess I never know whether I have this sympathy for the tradition and a kind of love for the tradition, and I wonder if it's not just a nostalgia. And I hope that's in a good sense, that there's things in here worth reclaiming. But I get increasingly worried that we're past the retrieval point, that it's
Interesting.
It's now slipping into the dangerous. I don't know.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. One more?
Got about 3 minutes,
Okay.
Marianne. I can bring one more in here if you want.
I think, is it Rudy? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, Rudy, why don't, and then I'll do a close and then we'll continue this at coffee time.
Yes, hello. I've put a few things in the chat, but I'll,
Good, thank you. I'll make sure I get a copy of the chat after the fact.
yeah. There's another Irish poet I want to recommend, Micheál O'Shea, who addresses God as Madam Jazz and speaks of the infinite improvisations we are capable of and invited to. So that's another metaphor to use and to think about.
Madam Jazz, that's really fabulous.
I want to question though the notion that we, either Earth or humanity, are insignificant. I think we are the only species who has built things like the Webb telescope. The only species, as far as we know, that wonders about why is there anything. But also we have to account for the fact that we seem to be the only species who are capable of both building something like the Taj Mahal and the gas ovens of Auschwitz. Right? We are, as far as we know, unique in certain respects.
Yeah, I mean the point of introducing a cosmic perspective and of seeing the minuscule dust-like particle of dust-like quality of Earth and our life on Earth is precisely what you're saying. That is to say, to appreciate this sort of Camelot moment in the cosmos where the universe becomes aware of itself and says, "Hallelujah!" Thanks be to God. So it's an attempt to see ourselves, to see the uniqueness and the preciousness of this fragile little planet, which is heading for oblivion, right? When the sun expands and the earth is gone, and it's a moment of appreciation. That expansion is a moment of appreciation, not an attempt to say we're insignificant. 5 pounds of I read something the other day. 5 pounds of meat, the human brain, behind the Webb telescope that is looking at the universe. It's back to like 250,000 years after the Big Bang. 5 pounds of meat did that. The other thing too is not to forget that, given the mathematical probabilities, there are very likely, not just possibly, but likely, hundreds of thousands of other intelligent traditions that have maybe come and gone, some that are still to come. So we're in a Goldilocks spot here, but that could be true of countless other intelligent creatures.
It may be so, but we don't know, right? As far as we know, we're the only ones.
That's right.
Well, statistically, there has to be, I think. But
we're,
I think that's an unknown. It's an unknown. It's an unknown. Jack will accuse me of being a historian again, but that's just what I go all the time. My reading of the Hebrew Bible says the primary purpose of Yahweh the primary purpose of God is to remind us we're not. And I think when we start talking about our significance, what the cosmos says is, yeah, it's a nice thing, but you know, on the scale of the cosmos, we're not going to be here that long. We're a blip.
And
both-
while we're here,
both-
we
both
better make the best
personally-
of it.
Both personally and as a species, we're a blip on the scale of the cosmos.
And while we're here, it matters how we treat one another.
Yes,
And I know you know that. So we may be insignificant in terms of the cosmos, but here we are. Isn't it something?
Well, insignificant is always a relative term.
Absolutely.
What? So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
And-
let me do a brief close. One thing, our next second Saturday will be January 13th, so I will look forward to seeing some of you then. And let me tell you what what our closing music is going to be. I chose Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. And Brandon, maybe it's nostalgia. I have always been very moved by that story of Jesus in the garden saying to Mary, "Do not cling to me." And I may still be clinging to Jesus. But I first heard Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring when I was about 10. I was not raised in the church, but I got baptized when I was 10 in a Dutch Reformed church of all things in Tarrytown, New York. And it was kind of it was a private baptism, and I didn't understand why and wherefore. So, but anyway, I was baptized. It was embarrassing. Apparently it took. And I was in church one time in this Dutch Reformed church, and Mrs. Johansson sang Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. And there was something about her voice and something about the music, and I don't think I understood the words, but it absolutely transported me. And it still does. And perhaps we could hear the lyrics even in a theopoetic way. Jesu, joy of man's desiring, holy wisdom, love most bright, drawn by thee, our souls aspiring, soar to uncreated light. Word of God, our flesh that fashioned with the fire of life impassioned, striving still to truth unknown. So we will hear that as our closing music. And I will, for those of you who can continue our coffee time, we will begin in about 3.5 minutes and continue our conversation until about 11:25. Okay. Thank you so much to Brandon and Scott for being with us today. And thank all of you for engaging and for the stimulating conversation, and keep it going. So see you next time.